God, this really is like Pinky in the Brain, isn't it?
Hi, everyone, and welcome to the first episode of our brand new podcast, The Digital Difference. And we are a podcast for IT leaders and those interested in digital products, where we discuss ideas, news, and fresh perspectives about the web, apps, and emerging technologies. And I want to introduce you first to my co-host, Auburn Hampton.
Hello, everyone. My name is Auburn Hampton.
How are you doing?
No, I'm all right. This is where I introduce myself. Hello,
Yeah.
I am the other half of Fluff Software. Is this Fluff Software related?
It is.
Is this? Okay. Yeah, I'm the junior software dev. Scott's brother-in-law. A little bit of nepotism involved there. Don't worry about it. Yeah, I look after social media. We're here to talk about low code, no code. I'm very excited. Scott, back to you in the studio.
Yeah, I mean, as you said, Auburn, we work together at Fluff Software. We are a software agency based out of Swindon in the UK. And we really wanted to start a podcast just to chat about all of the cool things that happen in technology at the moment, and really break it down for us people that work in it, but also people who are interested in it as well. And hopefully there's some useful advice in here, some interesting points and some things you can take away and implement in your own roadmaps or products. As you said, Auburn, we wanted to kick this one off with low code or no code. We'll get into the differences between those in a minute, but it's a really interesting emerging space at the moment, right? It seems to be everywhere in the news. It seems to be all over the place. But I think certainly for me, coming from a development background myself, I don't quite know where to integrate it into what we do on a day-to-day basis. It seems to have some cool points about it, and we'll cover those. But like, how do we as everyday people get involved? So to start off with, Auburn, we hear about low code, no code a lot, right? Have you got a simple definition for it? What is it for the average person?
I mean, let's be honest, it's pretty self-explanatory. Low code requires a bit of knowledge, a bit of coding. No code, anyone could do it. Your mum could do it. I don't know if your mum could do it. It's a bit weird how we're talking about your mum on a software podcast. But moving on.
But I think that's a good point. And whenever I see these two terms, they're always used together. So actually low code and no code, I think, are conflated a lot of the time. And actually, we'll get into this in a little bit, but from what I've seen and my experience of it, even no code isn't quite for the average non-techie person. I think there's certainly some applicable parts of it, but I don't think you can just throw it at anyone and just replace a development team straight away.
Exactly. You need a little bit of know-how. Like, it's not like Wix. I suppose that's a no-code platform.
Yeah.
But that's more aimed towards people who don't really know what they're doing. Can I say that?
Yeah, there's those template-based editors, aren't there, where websites are a really great example. So you've got Wix, you've got Squarespace, all those types of platforms where anyone can just go on, select a template that looks great, and get running with the site. And I think there's probably some overlap with no code there. As to quite how customizable they are is another question. I think really where low code and no code start coming into play is when you need something a little bit more custom than just out of the box template. A really common one that's often used and thrown into a company first is something like Zapier. So Zapier is a platform where you can plug together different systems and automate processes just by dragging and dropping things, basically, and kind of doing the wiring up without any code needed at all. And so that's a really great example of a no code platform. But even to use that, there needs to be some knowledge of what you're going to automate in the first place and how you might go about doing it. And then removing the code is kind of a useful step, just to not have to get into the boilerplate stuff that you might have to write if you were coding from scratch. And so, yeah, I think that's an interesting point, is like, where do the template editors come into this whole scale of things, and are they on the no code scale?
I agree.
Cool. Mm-hmm. So, what's been your experience of these different platforms and tools? We've obviously had a bit of a look at these as part of our own company for the past 6-12 months. And there's some really interesting stuff out there, isn't there? I mean, do you want to walk through some of the examples that you've seen in the space?
Yeah, the main one we've actually used more than any of the other is Webflow. I'd say more low code than no code, because you definitely do need a bit of technical know-how. And Webflow, it's basically how we create websites for our clients. Our websites run on Webflow. It's similar to Wix in a sense, where we make websites and you can drag and drop element, but it's a lot more customizable. Like you were saying earlier with Wix, it's more templates. You choose what looks nice. With Webflow, we can create more custom websites, pretty much.
This was our first toe in the water, really, wasn't it, with the low code platforms? And so my background personally has been in web development for about a decade now, and coming from that world where we used to code everything from scratch, actually using a tool like Webflow is really interesting, especially from an agency point of view, where we're trying to get things out of the door for our clients with as low cost to them as possible. Something like Webflow is great because actually for 90% of websites that are just basic marketing sites, landing pages, those types of things, it does a really good job of giving you the tools to knock that stuff up really, really quickly. And you mentioned there as well, didn't you, about the fact that you need a little bit of coding knowledge. And I think Webflow seems to almost be a codeless kind of wrapper around a lot of the code underneath it, if that makes sense. You're still dealing with the same principles, aren't you? Things like
elements, divs, all that fun stuff.
Exactly.
But it's obviously in a drag and drop form.
Yeah. And I think it's probably easier for people to learn in that manner. I think someone could pick up Webflow with a non-coding background, spend some time with it and really get to know that side of things. But certainly a bit of coding knowledge will give you a big head start in that area.
Yeah, I agree. Another low code platform that we've dipped our toes into recently is AppGyver, but we've also dabbled with Bubble.io. AppGyver, similar principle to Webflow, mainly aimed towards mobile apps. But they can also do the web apps, the TV apps, and all that fun stuff. We've used it recently just to mock up a quick MVP for a potential client. Another one, Bravo Studio, mainly aimed towards designers. So if you've got the designers out there who use Figma, Adobe XD Designs, you can literally just click a button, turn them designs into an actual functional. What's functional?
Yeah.
Functional website. And with that one, you just connect it up with a back end with a REST API. Bob's your uncle. It works.
Yeah.
Scott, thoughts?
Yeah. So I think mobile apps and web apps are definitely a newer area in this low code space, but lots of options out there already and lots of innovation happening. So you mentioned AppGyver at the start there, which we are using quite effectively at the moment. And again, it helps for those sites where the boilerplate is just going to be the same old boilerplate that we've written, time and time again. It gets us thinking about the more specific thing we're trying to solve for that need. So like you mentioned, we've used it quite effectively in those proof of concept stages where we just need to get something in the hands of users. And you can quite often do that with prototypes through Figma or some other software. But actually, you can bring down the development of a fairly simple app from weeks potentially down to hours, if maybe days or hours. It really is that quick with some of these platforms. And then what was the other one you mentioned?
The other one was Bravo Studio.
Bravo Studio,
the one that's more aimed for designers.
This is a really cool entry point, I think. So you might end up using something like AppGyver or Bubble to replace or to get the dev team to speed up development of their part. But actually tools like Bravo Studio kind of enter a new space where if you've got a design team who just need to get beyond a very basic prototype and get something working, like maybe that's enough. Maybe you could just plug that tool into that team and have them create all the basics. And I guess there's a question of like, how far do these things scale? Would you really want that type of app into production with actual users? Is it fine for the first handful of users? It's going to really depend on the situation. But I think all of these things bring different opportunities in where you might fit them in. And there's been a lot of interesting stuff happening in that space, I think. And then the other thing that I think a lot of people don't necessarily consider with low code, but it's definitely lots of options out there, are more of the back end development. So we can use things like Bubble to create a web app that you can run on your phone or on your computer. We can use things like AppGyver to create native apps that can run on iOS and Android. You can use things like Webflow to create websites that we can build and people can access. But then the question is how do you get data into them and back out of them? How do you authenticate people? So you need a login screen that people can actually log into. And there's now being a real insurgence of apps in that space or sites in that space that can help you build a back-end functionality. So some examples are things like Airtable or even Google Sheets, where you can just store data in a spreadsheet somewhere, and there are lots of ways to get data in and out of those and have those act as a back end. Again, a sort of question mark there of like, how far does that scale? How good is that really? But actually, for something like an internal app in a company, maybe that's enough. Maybe you're just automating booking system that you've got internally, and actually you don't need a really fancy back end for it. And then there's platforms like Firebase, that's been around for a long time, obviously Google owned, which provides authentication out of the box to a lot of these platforms. Like AppGyver will just talk one-on-one with them and provide the authentication layer, the database layer, all that good stuff just out of the box. And then other ones are things like backendless, which again is doing a lot of work in that space, so providing that back end. So really, like, the whole stack can be managed with low code or no code elements.
Yes, they can.
Any thoughts on
that? Yeah, mate, I agree with everything you've just said.
Okay.
So where does no code fit in with like the average company?
Yeah, this is a really good question. I think this is the question that springs to mind for most people looking at this this type of topic from now on. So like we said, I think from my experience and certainly from what I've read in the industry, there is a real use case for this type of stuff to quickly develop applications. However, with any of these platforms, you're almost certainly going to be working within some walls or some barriers. So take, for example, Webflow. You know, we've certainly seen a lot of interactive websites built in that space, and really interesting, innovative stuff happening on those sites. There may, for example, come a point where it just gets too complicated within that platform to do really out there stuff. So you can, in a lot of these, and Webflow's included, adding your own custom code. You can literally write your own JavaScript, HTML, and CSS to augment anything that's not out of the box. However, if you're doing 50% of the work in the code there, perhaps it's more useful just to be working within a proper development environment. So using something like VS Code to actually code with, you know, properly maintaining that source code through version control, everything else that we know and have. So I think it's worth considering what you're doing on these platforms. If like 80-90% of apps that are created out there, they're fairly similar to other apps that have existed in the past, there's probably a good chance that actually using something like AppGyver would be a really great option, especially, I think, if you're trying to test an idea. So if you just want to get something out there quickly, they're really valuable. If you're not worried necessarily about where is this app going to be in 5-10 years time, you know, how does my pipeline look at that point? How am I going to keep this updated? If that's less of a concern today, then I think these platforms are really interesting. And by the way, I think actually that there's lots of opportunity for all these things to scale, and many arguments to use these because of the long-term support. But, you know, there's pros and cons with everything. But I think for those getting things out there quickly, avoiding the boilerplate problem and just focusing on what you want to build, that's the kind of magic of what you're doing, this will work really well for, I think.
Yeah. So obviously there's going to be limitations with no code, as you've just said there. The main thing being the platforms are more constrained. So there's like a certain limit of how customized your project can actually be.
Yeah. If I haven't made that clear already, I think that concern is getting less every day. I think almost all of the platforms these days let you code outside of the walls of what they give you out of the box.
Yeah. But we used that the other day. For example, we used on Webflow, we were trying to get the newsletter, the HTML of the newsletter on the Webflow, on the newsletter page itself. Shout out to the newsletter. If you haven't signed up for it, sign up for it.
Thanks.
And yeah, we had some issues there. For example, in Webflow, there's an embed element where you can just type your code in directly. So we copied and pasted the HTML, and then it says it's exceeded the limit. So we had to then go and remove the white space and then paste that in. And even then, in the end, it only showed half of it.
Yeah.
So even though you are able to customize it with your own code, it can bring up some weird and wonderful bugs.
Yeah, it really can. And then, you know, there certainly are workarounds. And I think having a creative mind, as most developers do these days, being pragmatic, you know, there are ways around some of these things. But for some cases, there just won't be as well. Some platforms just won't work nicely together, or the workarounds will be too much that it doesn't quite work. You know, it might actually work in terms of requirements, but it's a messy way of doing things. I guess in terms of other limitations, there is the whole scale problem. If you're developing a really big app in terms of the scale of users coming on board, the scale of data, which is probably the main thing actually we're talking about here, or even the speed of data, those are things that may well be a concern with an out-of-the-box platform like you get here. So if you were building something with really high data throughput, so something, for example, like a finance application or a medical app, or something with kind of Internet of Things type approach where you're getting data from lots of sensors on a very real-time basis, you know, that will take real consideration of what platform you're going to use to transmit that data back and forth, to store it. It's highly likely that a high code solution there might be preferable.
Yeah, another limitation is that sometimes you are locked into these vendors, you're locked into their platforms. The code that's generated is convoluted, so you can't really take it out of that website. You're kind of stuck with that vendor. And if somewhere down the line there's a cheaper vendor available, or you want to move to a different platform, you kind of, in some cases, you'll have to completely start from scratch, because it's not as easy as copying that code over.
Yeah, this is interesting, isn't it? Because the whole development space over the past 5 years or so has really been moving to this this mindset, really, of like, let's be able to let's write our code once and be able to take it anywhere. Whether that be splitting down code so that you can swap modules in and out, or whether it's writing it once for a platform like Google Cloud and then being able to port that to Amazon Web Services, for example, because of cost issues or license issues or whatever reason. There's been a whole shift in our landscape to be able to do that quite easily. And then you get these platforms where you are choosing the platform and you're pretty locked in. And like you say, a lot of these, they give you the option to export the code. So Webflow will give you the option to export the code, and it's pretty good code. Don't get me wrong. Probably unlikely that you're going to be taking that code and then iterating on it. I don't see much need for that, and certainly I've not seen many people doing that. Whether there are or not, I'm not sure. But I would suspect that if you were going to be taking a project out of something like Webflow because it got too big, or because you wanted to move away from the costs or whatever reason, I would find it hard to believe that you would use that code for much longer.
So when I was doing my research for the podcast, it came up that a limitation could be that it promotes shadow IT, which creates security risks. Now, I don't really know what shadow IT is, so I'm hoping you know what it is.
Oh, all too well, unfortunately.
Here we go.
So shadow IT is basically when so I'll give you an example. So if a development team are building applications for the internal company, so they might be going back to our booking system example, they might be creating a booking system for the internal users to use. There may well be a requirement that someone has for another system. Let's say a sales tracking tool, for example. So they currently use a spreadsheet, but they want something a bit more than that now. They might go to their development team as their policy might dictate, and it might just happen that the team are too busy to work on that right now. So what tends to happen in those scenarios, or there's various reasons why it happens, but non-IT people will then go and create their own solution, whether it be a really effective spreadsheet to do it or some other solution. Robots are a really interesting one that a lot of companies have started introducing to automate some things, and they put them into place. The problem with that is that any system, whether it's quite simple or not, usually requires things like maintenance, things like updates, making sure it's secure, making sure no data can go anywhere, all the IT concerns that we normally have. And there's this worry that almost shadow IT pockets are created in the company where they're looking after their own things, but not necessarily going through the same principles that the actual IT department would. And so shadow IT is normally a really bad thing for a company to have. And it can speak to a lot of problems in the structure or the workload of different departments. But I think low code can bring about this idea that any department, so for example, the accounting department that might need the tool, could suddenly create a low code solution for themselves. And there is that risk of security. If they're not considering security, as why would they? They probably know about security from things like GDPR regulations and other regulations that are going on, but really they don't know the day in and day out problems that we have to solve with our applications, and they won't be thinking about those same things when they apply them to this solution. So I think that's the danger with some of this low code stuff, is that the proper roles aren't included in the development of them, and that can create some problems, whether it's security, I guess security is the big one, ultimately that's the probably biggest danger. But equally, things like data loss that could happen quite easily if things aren't managed correctly, and that could be critical to a business. So I think that's a really interesting point, and I would wager that security is pretty good generally on most of these platforms. Probably a lot of them are backed by things like AWS or Google Cloud, which again probably have a better security principles than if you were to code something from scratch. But it's quite easy to do stuff with the data outside of the platform that would then maybe compromise that. And I guess that probably leads us neatly onto like who should be developing these sort of applications, because again, I think the promise of them is that you don't need a lot of technical knowledge to do that. That's not quite been my experience, or at least in the successful situations, that's not been my experience. What are your thoughts on that, Auburn?
So it seems pretty much anyone can use the actual low-code platforms, but it's really aimed at the more technical people who actually know about security and know what they're doing in a sense.
So, like we said, I think that taking that shadow IT problem, I think you probably need to introduce the right people around whoever is developing it, whether that's developers or people that have learned the platform sufficiently to be able to create something with it. So big things are probably architecture, first of all. Obviously, architecture is hugely important for any company that's developing software, whether it be in low code or high code. I think just having someone who can consult on that basis is really useful. Where does this thing that we're creating fit in with a wider landscape within the company? Is low code the right opportunity for that system? And architecture concerns may fall into that. But then, yeah, just how does it fit in, and also how should it be working with regards to everything else that's in the company? I think a lot of systems are probably going to interlink with whatever you create in low code, and even if they are standalone, it needs to be supported beyond just the person that's building it for the start, for the first version. And so if it can be picked up and integrated with the rest of the company, then that's a really useful thing. So I think architecture is super important. Project management probably goes without saying, but making sure that whatever it is being developed for the right requirements, for the right people, and in the right way. We can certainly apply things like agile principles to a lot of this stuff. Even if it's quick to build, we should still be testing along the way, using all the good agile principles that we all know and follow for the most part. Things like testers, it probably goes without saying, but making sure that you've got a team who can test, both from a user testing point of view, but also people that are going to try and break it, essentially. So a good QA mindset will be essential in that, because it's quite easy in even these low code situations to develop things that have bugs. We certainly haven't got away with not having bugs anymore by introducing these platforms. And so all of those typical resources I think are super useful. Traditional IT or the infrastructure people will also be really interested, I think, because these platforms almost certainly always have a cost involved, even if they're just a front end thing. And again, it's useful for the people who are running the infrastructure to consolidate that cost into something that they are considering, just making sure that it aligns with everything else, and that they're making the most out of their platforms at the moment. So I think that's a good, hopefully, set of people to support whoever's developing it. And then there's the question of who is developing it. And I think actually low code is a fantastic opportunity for developers, for one, but also people that have just got a kind of technical mindset. So people from the kind of STEM related backgrounds, maybe lower level people in that area, lower experienced people, they'll be really great at running with one of these tools without really thinking about it too much.
So when would you use low code / no code solutions as opposed to pure code or full code? What's the term? Full code, mixed code, high code? There we go.
Yeah, any one of those, I think.
Yeah.
I think, like we've said before, they're really great at creating things fast. So I think if you've got capacity problems with a development team, if they are really struggling to get things built, and you've got a big backlog that's growing, then maybe using low code to help get some of that backlog done would be helpful for them. I think the thing is with a lot of these tools is that they do require some time to learn. So it's not like you're just going to drop it into a team mid-sprint and get them building things. But certainly if that's a common problem for your organization, then actually moving to some of these platforms might be something to help just get rid of that boilerplate, just get rid of the time people are spending on the day-to-day, just building the foundations of products, basically. Another long-term strategy it can really help with is just being able to have it move and grow with an organization. So really, pushing that agile to its limits, being able to really quickly implement features and really have them to the point where you can quickly put them in, scale them back, change them. It's really, really quick to just modify low code things in a way that high code sometimes doesn't have the same effect with. With high code, we're so often focused about making sure things are future proof, making sure that things are built in a way that's not going to break. And of course, that's essential with low code. But I think the way that they're structured is much easier to adapt going forward. And so, yeah, speed and pace are really the things that these inform. There's going to be a bit of a curve and a hump to get over with that, first of all. But once you've got over that, it can really, really speed up a development pipeline.
And like you've just said there, another great way to use low code is modifying already existing legacy apps. So say that you just need to improve on the security, or say you've already got a web app that you need to turn into a mobile version of that same app.
We can certainly increase pace by developing things quicker, but actually one of the big stumbling blocks is coming up with requirements, isn't it? That is a big piece of time that takes it out of our roadmap. So if you've got a known problem, if you've got something that just needs to be updated or migrated to a different platform, like you say, if you've got a known quantity, actually moving it to one of these platforms might be a really quick thing to do. And it's also a great use case for learning that platform as well. If you've got something that's known and you're just moving it to one of these platforms, it's a great way to learn it without having to think too much about how what you should be building in the first place. So yeah, really good idea.
Thank you, Dad. I mean, Scott. I mean, boss. So how does it help like the day-to-day developer, and what about small companies?
Yeah, I think a lot of developers are still scared by these platforms. I think they are.
I agree. Yeah,
because it's a valid concern. I think all these platforms seem to come out with the marketing of you don't need a dev team anymore, which, as we said, just isn't the reality. I had a really good analogy the other day, which was that we used to write in assembly code, then we moved to higher order languages, things like Java, JavaScript, C Sharp, those types of languages that let us not worry about the implementation so much and actually focus on the actual code that we're trying to write to solve a problem. And in many ways, low code systems are just another level up from that. So they provide the boilerplate out of the box for you, and you can just focus on providing the solution. But you still need that engineering mindset to be able to implement solutions effectively in a lot of these platforms. So actually, I think us developers have nothing to worry about. These are going to be tools that help us, right?
Yeah. So people are sort of scared, like, oh, these platforms are going to take me job. But it's no, people, they need professionals who know how to then work these platforms. Like we were saying, it's not Wix. It's not a simple drag and drop. You need to have the mentality of a developer to put this into perspective. Is that the term?
Yeah. I think you're totally right. It's going to be another tool in our toolbox.
Another way it can help small companies is, say you don't have a development team in at all. We all know developers aren't cheap, especially quality developers. So if you do have the technical know-how, I've used that term too many times in this podcast, but if you do have the technical know-how, then you could, in theory, create a software project yourself.
Well, yeah, obviously we've covered that. I think you need some technical knowledge. Certainly, if you've got those people around you that can support. So maybe it's an outsourced partner who can help to provide some of the architecture concerns. As long as you've got someone who can really dive deep into testing, and a lot of this stuff you can outsource as well. But I think, it may be that someone internally can be trained up on a platform like this to develop something. And again, I think in terms of internal applications and small proof of concepts, that stuff is really viable. And actually, another really good category to start with in a lot of these is just automating some of the day-to-day processes. We talked about Zapier right at the start, but that's a really useful platform to get started with that will let you just automate some of the stuff, whether it's when a lead comes in, you need to get it over to your, when a lead comes into your email inbox, for example, you need to get it over to your CRM, and then you need to make sure that goes through the right stages. Those types of things are just so useful to go into Zapier, and it's a toe in that water of just starting to automate and starting thinking about how you can use these types of platforms to really accelerate what you do every day.
So we touched on briefly about like vendor lock-in. Is this something people should be concerned about?
I think it's another thing to consider. So whilst it's certainly more difficult to move from these platforms, or impossible in some instances, how much is that really outweighed by the benefits of that platform? So it may be that you are locked in, but as long as you do your due diligence and pick a platform that seems like it's backed with a good company, that it's going to be supported for the long term, that you can get a good support contract in place, those types of things, as long as you're confident the platform is going to be around for the lifetime of the product, then perhaps the lack of portability might be outweighed by just the speed that you can develop on these types of platforms. Even though we might think that we develop code, let me start again. And even though we do develop code these days in a way that is portable, in practice, how often do we really do that? And how often do we spend time on making things portable, never to see the benefit of them? And that time all adds up. That the way that we create things these days does take time to do, and is a good thing to do. But we almost, certainly in my experience, never really see the benefits of actually going through and doing that. So there are certainly benefits that can be gained on these platforms that may outweigh some of the drawbacks, like potential lock-in.
Let's be honest, it kind of is the future, low code. They're around for at least the foreseeable future. I wouldn't say it's a real issue.
No, and a lot of the companies are very big. We've got platforms like Firebase, which isn't a true low code, but is backed by Google, and is certainly developing lots of things like AppGyver, and has been acquired by SAP, which is another huge company developing in that space. I think a lot of these companies are going to be around for the long term, and there's certainly a lot of innovation, which is something to be mindful of. There are a lot of companies springing up and doing really interesting stuff, but how much you want to bet your mission critical production systems on them is another question, and again, just something to consider. But yeah, there is that ability to develop things really fast, and if you had to build it in another similar platform that was competing in that space, would it be the end of the world compared to what you're getting from that type of service?
And the answer is no. Well, or is the answer yes?
It depends, but yeah,
the answer is it depends.
It depends. All these things depend, right? And it's the same thing we go down for choosing what technologies we use or any other decision, really. It's another thing. But I think there's so much being thrown around with low code and no code being relatively new. I think a lot of people think of it as gimmicky, whereas if developers start to adopt it and it's adopted by the right sorts of people, it can be a really powerful tool.
Yeah. Didn't they think back in the day JavaScript was a gimmick, and now it's like the world's most popular programming language?
Yeah, and JavaScript front end is still in that space, I think, of somewhat infancy, but it's just about picking the right tool for the job. And low code is just another one of those tools that is, like you say, is definitely going to be about and becoming more and more important for companies to look at.
So we did touch upon the security of it, but have you got anything else to say, like how secure you think the infrastructure actually is behind the low code platforms?
So most of them seem to be doing a pretty good job of security. So the low code platforms, they need to provide a really secure place for you to build from, because there's no options to tweak that. So it has to be really secure out of the box. Yeah. It also needs to scale well, because you could be developing a really simple application for one user. You could be developing an application for 10,000 users on there. They don't know what you're building. So once you've picked one that's applicable, there's a good chance that it's set up really well for what you're building. And again, it's another consideration, right? It's another checkbox exercise that you'll go through on that discovery journey. But I think it's surprising how many different platforms are there. We've only touched on a few this episode, but it really is surprising how many platforms are out there at the moment doing very varying things on similar themes, but they all come with their own benefits, drawbacks. Some are concerned more with security, some are more concerned with speed and scale, some are more concerned with like giving you no opportunity to code, but it being more applicable to those designers, for example. So yeah, loads of options, and really it's a good opportunity for you to really take stock of what you need and what the right option is going to be. So with
low code being still relatively new, like the pricing, how's it sort of set up? Are all the platforms similar pricing? I don't even know. I don't even know Webflow. I use it almost every day. I don't know how you pay for that.
Yeah, I think a lot of them are fairly competitive with each other. But a lot of them address different parts of the market as well. So we got talking the other day to a company who were at the Stoke on Tech event that we went to, and they are very much positioning at the enterprise market, so solving a very different need and problem than something like AppGyver is, for example, or Bubble, whereas they are much more probably entering the kind of SME market or startup market, I would wager. And pricing, of course, then is very different. They're priced to appeal and provide the level of service that you would expect for an enterprise product. And so I think there's lots of different pricing models, as there are with anything. The typical ones that we tend to see, especially for those that have a back-end component, so things like Bubble and AppGyver. Well, actually, AppGyver is totally free. Sorry, for things like Bubble and have that kind of back-end authentication or storage mechanism, I've seen pricing typically kind of per resource minute or resource hour. So you're really paying for that kind of compute resource. So if all of these, a lot of the code that it generates is still running on real server somewhere, and you pay for that as you would with any cloud resource. So it will calculate per second costs, and then add those up and charge you for the amount total that you've computed your code on. And others are kind of per user or per month, even on a specific plan with limits. So loads of options out there, but they are all pretty competitive, which is good for us.
Nice. So the answer is it depends on how much you use the app.
Yeah. We've come down to that lot, though, haven't we? And I think it's really exciting because there's not just one or two options that you can pick. There's loads of different options for whatever type of thing you're creating. So actually the fact that it depends is really, really interesting, I think, at the moment.
Yeah. Right. We probably piqued a couple of listeners' interests in low code, no code. No code, low code. It's the same thing. So how would they go about moving their projects to a low code platform?
Yeah, I hope we have, because like I say, I think it's interesting. And I think that is a really good point, is where would you get started with this? Because you're going to have some companies who don't have any development pipeline at all. Then they're not creating things currently. And actually, I think it's quite simple for those use cases, because a lot of these platforms are really good at creating out of the box apps, web apps, experiences, integrations, automations, whatever you're doing. Really good tutorials and kind of out of the box setups for those. I think it's more interesting when you have a current development team who are developing things in JavaScript, in Python, in whatever. How would you get started with something like this? Like I said before, there is, first of all, the thing to consider, which is the learning curve. There is definitely a learning curve with all of these platforms. That aside, something new, greenfield is obviously a really good way to start breaking this stuff in, especially for internal applications. So things that if it ends up not being quite what you imagined, but it still does the job, then that's a really good way to start learning what the limitations are. And then if you're moving something away or starting to integrate it with a wider coded high code landscape, using those kind of good engineering principles that we tend to follow. So decoupling the architecture, making sure that every different part of the architectural system is separate in as far as it can be, and is talking through common things like APIs and those types of interfaces, can be a nice way of then that wider system talking to a low code solution without too much pain. And again, that also then gives the opportunity to replace that thing at some point as well. If it gets to a point where it scales, or low code is just no longer an option for that thing, then you can replace that one piece without breaking everything else. So yeah, I think definitely look for opportunities in those greenfield and internal applications first, and also for those pieces of an architecture, especially if it's kind of an aging architecture where you really need to upgrade some parts of it. Building out new UIs and new automations can be really powerful, just in terms of a specific part of it.
Any other challenges you can think of?
I think challenges in terms of low code are, one big thing is because of the speed of development, and it really is a case of some applications that used to take weeks or months can take hours or days. It really is very, very fast. We spoke about it earlier, but that whole requirements gathering piece and actually handing it over to a business can take a while to catch up. We're getting much better as development teams and IT teams in terms of integrating and showing what we're doing to a business early on, so they can get ready for it, whether it's creating a marketing plan, for example, for an external product, or whether it's a company whether it's an internal team that's picking up some instructions on how to use an new internal application. With the speed that things are getting out there, it can be quite difficult for a business to catch up to what's being developed at that pace. So that is one of the more common challenges that seems to be out there.
Yeah.
And then, like I say, the only other places that I think in terms of challenges, what you might find challenging implementing in one of these types of systems are things that are either very custom, so maybe really high machine learning requirements in there that might be very difficult to implement at the moment, very high throughput or data kind of capture. But those problems are becoming less and less every day. And I think there are more and more of these platforms solving them as well.
At the end of the day, it's a new thing in the development world. It's only going to improve. So any challenges that we see now may not be a challenge in the future.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, solid. Right. I'm sick of staring at myself now, mate. I haven't been looking at you. I've just been looking at myself in the corner there.
What a treat.
Yeah, I know. Well, just judging, seeing if you can see my messy room or not.
Well, you've got it blurred, so that's
yeah, something. That is true. That is true. Benefits of Zoom, eh?
It is. Well, in that case, let's wrap this one up. But I'd like to thank everyone who's listened to this for joining us today. Yeah. We're planning to have these every 2 weeks, so we'll be releasing the next episode very soon. Please do share this with anyone that you think might find it useful. We'll be picking a new topic for the next one, but for this one, where we talked about low code, I think it applies to so many companies. And if you know someone that might benefit from hearing it, we would love if you could share it with them. Do subscribe to us, and you can find out more about the show at thedigitaldifference.show. You can find more about us at fluff.software. And last but not least, I'd like to thank you, Alban. Thanks for spending today with me. And
thank you very much. The secret code is pineapple. If you've made it this far, you get 50 internet points. Congratulations. Yeah, I guess I'll see you in about 5 seconds when we end this call.
Cool. See you soon.
See you later.